Lay back, and imagine candlelight trembling on the walls of a small stone room. The year is 1349. Outside, a bell tolls, slow and distant, like a heart still beating beneath centuries of dust. Inside, a monk writes by lamplight, his quill scratching against parchment. His hands shake, not from age, but from fear. The words he writes are not prayers. They are warnings. If you read this, know that the tales are true. That's how the legend begins. But the strangest thing about this monk's confession isn't what he saw. It's that, centuries later, archaeologists would find his room exactly as he described, the same candles melted into stone, the same unfinished words. And in the silence of that discovery, one chilling realization whispered across time: sometimes, the stories we call legends are simply truths that waited too long to be believed. Tonight, we travel through those truths, 15 medieval tales once dismissed as superstition, gossip, or fear, until history quietly proved them right. In every village of the Middle Ages, stories grew like ivy on the walls of old houses. People whispered them by the fire, swore they'd seen things beyond reason. And yet, in the slow patience of centuries, many of those whispers turned out to be not imagination at all, but memory. Our first story begins in the quiet hills of Tuscany, around 1280. They called it the Singing Church. Peasants swore they heard voices echoing from the old chapel long after midnight, soft chants, wordless hymns, a harmony that drifted over vineyards when no one was inside. Priests dismissed it as imagination, whined through the cracks, maybe the echo of monks rehearsing. But in 1998, restoration workers in that same ruined chapel discovered what caused the sound. Behind the plaster walls were hollow clay jars, precisely tuned to musical notes. When the wind entered through narrow slits, it made the building itself sing. What villagers thought were ghostly hymns were actually medieval acoustics, an early experiment in sound design. It wasn't spirits, it was science, centuries ahead of its time. Yet the legend kept people coming to pray, even when the church was abandoned. Perhaps that was the miracle all along. Our second legend travels north, to Yorkshire, England, where people spoke in frightened tones about the Lantern Man. For generations, travelers claimed that a glowing light moved across the moors at night, sometimes following, sometimes leading. The story went that it was a spirit of a miner, trapped underground, forever warning others away from danger. Children were told to ignore the light, or it would lead them into the bog. Then, in the 1980s, scientists studying the area found that gases escaping from the marsh could spontaneously ignite, a phenomenon now called will-o'-the-wisp. The blue flames danced in the dark just as villagers described. But what no one could explain was how the legend predicted this centuries before science did. Maybe that's what truth often looks like, a guess whispered in the dark, waiting for the light to prove it right. In France, a darker rumor passed from mouth to mouth for over 400 years, a tale about a hidden city beneath Paris. People claimed that tunnels ran deep under the ground, filled with bones, forgotten cathedrals, and corridors so long you could lose your mind walking them. Medieval officials denied it. But when plague swept the city in the 14th century and burial grounds overflowed, whispers returned: the dead were being moved somewhere underneath. In 1786, workers digging a new well struck through to an enormous cavern filled wall to wall with skulls. Paris had literally been built atop its own forgotten cemetery, the catacombs. Over 6 million souls rested in neat rows beneath its streets. The urban legend was, in fact, an urban foundation. Every step above carried the weight of truth beneath it. The fourth tale comes from Poland, and it begins with laughter, the kind that dies too quickly. They called it the Laughing Tower. Villagers swore that those who spent the night near its ruins would wake up crying or mad. Inside, they said, walls whispered secrets. Archaeologists once mocked the story, until the early 2000s, when a restoration team studied the tower's structure. The acoustics were perfect for transmitting even the faintest whisper across the room, a medieval trick for spies and confessions. The legend of voices in the dark wasn't madness, it was architecture. Every word spoken inside had once been heard by someone else unseen. And that old laughter? It was the sound of a people realizing that their superstitions had always been observations. By now, you might notice a pattern. Medieval people, mocked for their fears, often understood more about their world than we gave them credit for. Their legends were, in many ways, folk science, wrapped in poetry, warning, or faith. Yet not all of them were about clever structures or gaslights. Some were about the human heart, and the way truth hides in emotion. One of the oldest legends told in the monasteries of Ireland spoke of the bell that wouldn't ring. A monastery had been destroyed in a storm, and only the bell tower survived. The monks rebuilt, hung a new bell, but no matter how hard they pulled, it made no sound. Years passed. They tried polishing, recasting, praying, nothing. Until one day, a young orphan novice climbed the tower alone and struck it softly with his hand. The bell rang so loud the hills echoed. Centuries later, researchers examining the site found that the metal was a unique mix of bronze and silver. The silver dampened the sound unless struck at a certain point. The bell could ring, but only by a human touch, not a rope. In every sense, it was waiting for kindness. And perhaps that's what makes these tales so lasting, not their mystery, but their humanity. The villagers, monks, and peasants who told them were not fools. They were witnesses. Before this part ends, let's visit one final legend, one that hums quietly beneath many European folk stories, the sleeping soldier of the mountain. All across medieval Europe, from Austria to Wales, people whispered of a warrior who slept beneath the earth, waiting to rise again when his land was in danger. In England, he was King Arthur. In Germany, Emperor Barbarossa. In Portugal, King Sebastian. Different names, same dream, that the good would return when most needed. For centuries, scholars dismissed it as national myth. But modern archaeology uncovered something unexpected. In many of these legendary mountains were hidden chambers and tunnels, sometimes carved in the same century the stories first appeared. Nobody knew who built them or why. Were they tombs? Shelters? Or perhaps people really did prepare for a king's return, creating truth from faith? What we know is this: the hope that someone noble sleeps beneath us is universal. And hope, after all, is the most believable legend of them all. As candlelight fades, the monk's parchment lies open again. The ink hasn't faded. It's as if he wrote it yesterday. He ends his confession with one quiet sentence. Legends are not born from lies. They are born from memory. Maybe, in the soft corners of history, that's the secret we keep forgetting. Because the truth about medieval legends is not that people once believed too much, but that we, perhaps, stopped believing too soon. When morning came to the old monk's valley, mist covered the stones like breath held between centuries. The world had changed, but the questions he left behind still wandered the roads, invisible pilgrims, searching for proof that wonder ever existed. By the 14th century, Europe was a patchwork of fears and faiths. Every town had its secret, every castle its shadow. The stories we'll walk through now were not born in royal courts but in the ordinary hearts of bakers, shepherds, and weavers, people who saw something, could not explain it, and turned the mystery into meaning. Our sixth legend comes from Bohemia, where villagers once whispered about the stone that wept. It began with a mason who built a bridge across the river Vltava. When it collapsed in a storm, he begged God for forgiveness and rebuilt it with his own hands. But one stone at the center arch was said to cry when touched by rain, thin lines of water seeping from it like tears. Pilgrims came to see it, believing it to be holy. Centuries later, historians confirmed that the legend wasn't entirely imagination. In 2003, restorers found that the weeping stone was carved from a rare porous limestone containing traces of salt crystals. When humidity rose, the salt drew moisture out in delicate rivulets, creating the illusion of tears. The mason's sorrow had become geology, emotion trapped in mineral. The villagers weren't wrong, they simply saw nature's sadness before science named it. Further north, in Scotland, stood a ruin locals called the Wall That Hummed. Fishermen told of strange vibrations echoing through the stones whenever storms gathered at sea. They swore you could feel the hum in your bones, as though the wall itself warned of danger. For centuries, the tale lingered, dismissed as fancy. Then, in the 1990s, engineers studying ancient lighthouses discovered that the ruins' position matched the intersection of two natural wind corridors. When high gales passed through narrow cracks in the stone, the vibrations produced a deep musical resonance, like the throat of the earth singing. The legend was true, and the warning hum really did precede storms. The wall was a medieval weather station, built not from superstition but from intuition, people listening closely to the voice of wind. The eighth tale belongs to Spain, and to a legend so quiet it nearly vanished, the bread of the dead. In a small Castilian village, families baked a single loaf each year on the night of All Souls. They left it at crossroads, believing spirits would eat from it and bless the harvest. Priests condemned it as pagan nonsense, and the tradition faded. When archaeologists excavated the site in 2017, they found breadcrumbs sealed in clay pots buried beneath crossroads stones, dating to the 13th century. Chemical analysis showed traces of rosemary and honey, both rare and sacred offerings. The villagers weren't feeding ghosts. They were feeding memory, leaving sweetness for those they'd lost. The legend of haunted bread turned out to be humanity's oldest kindness, the wish to share one more meal with the dead. Next we crossed to Norway, where a haunting story persisted through the ages, the singing sea. Sailors claimed that certain fjords sang at night, low, deep, and mournful, as if the waters themselves remembered something tragic. Skeptics blamed the echoes of waves, but in 2005 researchers discovered that particular inlets produced infrasonic tones due to unique underwater rock formations. These vibrations carried for miles, too low for normal hearing, yet felt in the chest. Those medieval sailors, terrified yet respectful of the sea, had truly heard its hidden music. What they called ghosts were frequencies of the earth itself. And so, once again, folklore became fact. The 10th legend leads us to Germany, where villagers spoke of a mirror that saw sins. In the small town of Aachen, a merchant kept a polished bronze mirror in his shop. Rumor said that anyone who looked into it with a guilty heart would see their reflection blur. Over centuries the mirror became an omen, thieves avoided it, lovers whispered before it. When it disappeared in the 1600s, the story died. Until 2008, when restorers cleaning an abbey attic found fragments of a concave bronze disc with traces of mercury, an early experimental mirror surface. When placed near candlelight, its curved design distorted reflections at certain angles, especially when the viewer moved. The mirror of sin was simply a scientific curiosity centuries ahead of its time, but perhaps also a moral one. It reminded people that conscience changes how we see ourselves. Sometimes technology and spirituality are not opposites but twins. Pause for a moment, Dost. Imagine all these stories whispering together, stones that cry, walls that sing, seas that hum, bread for the dead, mirrors that judge. Each once dismissed, now quietly vindicated. The Middle Ages begin to look less ignorant, more intuitive, a world that understood the poetry of reality long before textbooks did. But the next legends turn even closer to the heart. They are not about buildings or objects but about people, and how truth can hide inside compassion. In Florence, there was once talk of the doctor who healed with shadows. Records mention a physician named Matteo di Benvolio, around 1360, who claimed he could diagnose illness by studying a patient's silhouette on the wall. The church called it witchcraft. He was silenced, his notes destroyed. Centuries later, medical historians found surviving pages of his pupil's diary. Matteo had noticed that the tremor or stiffness in a person's shadow revealed diseases like palsy or fever before symptoms worsened. He was observing early signs of neurological disorders, a primitive form of diagnostic motion analysis. The legend of a sorcerer who healed with shadows turned out to describe the birth of medical observation. He was not reading magic, he was reading muscle. Our 12th tale drifts to Iceland, where people believed in the fire that never went out. A single lantern in a mountain chapel was said to burn for generations without oil. Travelers swore the flame was holy. In reality, they were witnessing a natural gas vent slowly leaking methane, ignited by lightning centuries ago, a gentle blue flame that burned endlessly under the altar stone. When scientists confirmed it in 2011, villagers laughed softly. "We told you," one elder said. "We just didn't know the word for it." It's humbling to realize faith preserved truth long before instruments did. The 13th legend lives in Hungary and begins with a curse. A noble family was said to suffer sickness every generation because their ancestor once cheated a poor farmer of his land. People dismissed it as myth, until genealogists traced the family estate and discovered a well contaminated by lead or running directly beneath their manor. For centuries, descendants drank from poisoned water. The curse wasn't magic, it was chemistry. And yet, in its own way, justice had worked itself quietly through time. The 14th legend brings us back to England, to a forest near Canterbury where travelers whispered about the road that disappeared. They said that on misty nights, the path itself would vanish, carts would sink, riders lose their way. In 2014, archaeologists mapping ancient trade routes discovered that a Roman road once ran through a patch of unstable marsh. During floods, the road's surface slipped beneath the bog, only to reappear when waters receded. Medieval villagers hadn't imagined a vanishing road, they had witnessed the ground breathing with rain. Nature was performing miracles before their eyes. Finally, the 15th legend, perhaps the most haunting, and most human. In France's Loire Valley, stories told of the girl who woke the dead. During the Black Death, villagers said a young woman's singing could rouse those on the brink of death, bringing brief moments of peace. Priests called her cursed. But when her grave was rediscovered in the 19th century, a small bell was found buried beside her, evidence of the medieval practice of attaching bells to coffins in case the dead were merely sleeping victims of plague paralysis. The resurrections she caused were likely people regaining consciousness at the sound of her voice. She hadn't defied death, she had comforted life hanging by a thread. In the calm rhythm of her song, hope had found its melody. As evening settles again over the monk's valley, imagine him hearing these stories carried by pilgrims returning from distant lands. He would nod softly, quill resting in his hand, whispering the same words he wrote long ago. If you read this, know that the tales are true. And perhaps that's the secret behind every medieval legend, not proof, not miracles, but a deep human instinct to listen to the world carefully, to find meaning in sound, shadow, and silence. Because truth does not shout, it lingers. It hums beneath walls, cries through stones, sings across seas. All we have to do is believe long enough to hear it. It is said that history forgets, but stones remember. In the centuries after the old monk's death, his valley fell silent. Monasteries crumbled, fields turned wild, and travelers hurried past the ruins without stopping. Yet sometimes, when mist rolled in from the river, people swore they could hear the faint scratching of a quill, as if someone, somewhere, was still writing. Maybe that's how legends work. They don't die. They just keep rewriting themselves until someone listens again. And in this next chapter of truths once thought impossible, we return to those who listened, peasants, wanderers, women and men who refused to let wonder disappear. Our 16th legend comes from Sicily, where they spoke of the moon that drank wine. It began as a tale told by shepherds, that every harvest moon, the vineyards glowed red as if the moon itself had stolen color from the grapes. They said the air smelled of sweetness and dreams. Scholars mocked it. But in 1999, astrophysicists studying atmospheric refraction over southern Italy discovered a rare phenomenon. During late autumn, microscopic particles from crushed grapes in the air can scatter light, tinting the moon faintly crimson. For centuries, villagers weren't romanticizing the moon, they were describing a natural wonder no one had measured. The moon did not drink wine, but the earth's breath had painted it so. It's strange, isn't it? The simplest people often see the universe most clearly. From wine we move to Wales, where a lonely mountain bore the name Cryphene, the weeping stone. Miners claimed that the mountain cried before disasters, water dripping from the caves like tears, days before a collapse. They thought it was cursed. But modern geology confirmed that certain underground rock types expand before seismic pressure, forcing out trapped moisture through fissures. What they called sorrow was science. The mountain wasn't warning them out of cruelty, it was speaking in the only language it knew, water. And so, the weeping mountain was real. The world had been kind enough to try and tell them. Our 18th legend drifts east to Prague, a city always balancing between light and shadow. Locals spoke of the clock that stole time. They said the great town clock once stopped for 3 days every century, and during those hours no one aged. Children stayed young, candles never melted, and lovers swore that time itself had held its breath. It sounds like a dream. But when restorers repaired the medieval mechanism in 2013, they found evidence that it was deliberately built to halt automatically once every 100 years, a maintenance feature to prevent gear stress, and though time never truly stopped, the legend of those frozen hours came from a place of awe, because for the people who depended on that clock, its silence did stop their world. The streets paused, waiting for the chime to return. That's what legends often are, human metaphors for dependence, the fragile cords tying our lives to rhythm and hope. Our 19th legend leads to France, to a village hidden beneath the Pyrenees, where locals once whispered about the door that wouldn't stay closed. They said that each night, no matter how tightly they barred it, the chapel door would swing open before dawn. The priest swore he locked it. People feared a haunting. But when historians examined the site decades later, they discovered that the chapel was built on uneven ground. As temperatures dropped overnight, moisture in the wooden frame condensed, causing expansion. As it warmed at sunrise, the contraction gently released the latch. The door's miracle was a breath of physics. But perhaps there's poetry in that even wood, in its quiet swelling and sighing, obeyed the rhythm of life. The villagers thought faith was holding it open. Maybe it was just the world breathing again. The 20th story, and perhaps the most touching, comes from a monastery in Austria, where they told of the library that never burned. In 1428, a fire swept through the abbey, destroying every room except the library. Monks believed angels had protected the books. The legend became famous, an eternal miracle of parchment and prayer. When scientists examined the ruins centuries later, they found the explanation. The library had been built with an early form of fireproof plaster made from lime and casein, a milk protein used by ancient builders. The monk who designed it, Brother Leonard, had studied old Roman techniques. His curiosity saved knowledge that would have vanished otherwise. Angels? Perhaps not. But an angelic mind, certainly, one that believed knowledge was holy enough to guard with innovation. The miracle, then, was not divine intervention but human devotion. Now we step into gentler ground, legends not of fear or science, but of love that endured the centuries. In Portugal, there is still told the legend of the river bride. A fisherman's daughter, they said, drowned on her wedding day. Her lover threw his net every evening, hoping she might rise once more. Villagers claimed they saw her reflection ripple in the river whenever he wept. A beautiful story, yet eerily, there may be truth. In 2016, hydrologists studying the region discovered a recurring surface phenomenon caused by warm and cold currents meeting at sunset, creating a shimmering mirage resembling a human silhouette. Was it the girl's ghost? No. But her grief had found a way to stay visible, water remembering emotion through light. Sometimes love itself carves science into the world. In Germany, another whisper persisted, the tree that knew names. Children claimed that when they touched a certain oak and spoke their names aloud, the bark would shift as if breathing, forming letters of light in the moon. Priests condemned the story as blasphemy. But villagers still visited at night to whisper wishes. When the tree finally fell in the 20th century, botanists studied its rings and discovered deposits of bioluminescent fungi living symbiotically within its bark. Under specific conditions, heat and breath could activate faint light patterns. The glowing letters weren't magic, but they were real. Those children weren't lying. The tree truly glowed for them, reacting to their warmth and voice. In a world that often dismisses wonder, perhaps the greatest miracle is that some legends never needed faith, just attention. Our 23rd legend lies within the icy silence of the Alps, where shepherds spoke of the snow that sang. They said that during certain nights, snowdrifts would hum, a soft, low tone rising from the ground. Scientists once called it imagination. Then, in the 1980s, mountaineers recorded what is now known as singing snow, caused by synchronized vibrations between ice layers as they shift under temperature changes. It was real all along, a symphony of cold. So many stories mocked by modern minds turn out to be testaments of ancient awareness. The medieval heart didn't misunderstand the world, it listened differently. By now, we've walked through nearly 24 legends reborn as truth. But this evening, isn't about proving the past right. It's about understanding what they were trying to tell us, that truth is never loud, and that belief, even misplaced, keeps memory alive until proof arrives. Imagine again that quiet monk, his hand trembling as he wrote in the candlelight. Perhaps he wasn't warning us of monsters or miracles. Perhaps he was simply trying to say, don't stop listening. Because everything, wind, stone, water, stars, is always speaking. And sometimes, when the night grows still enough, the silence itself remembers what we've forgotten. The rain had stopped. Somewhere beyond the ruined abbey, dawn drifted in with the color of old parchment, pale gold, quiet, forgiving. The monk's forgotten valley was breathing again, dew glittering on stones like tiny mirrors. And in that first fragile light, the world seemed ready to tell one last round of secrets. Because history, Dost, is not a line. It's a circle of whispers, every echo carrying forward, waiting for another century to listen. The legends that come now were once nearly erased, carried only in lullabies and diary margins. But they returned, because truth always finds a way through silence. Our 24th legend belongs to Croatia, and begins with the chapel that followed the sun. It was said the small stone chapel near Dubrovnik turned its face every morning, windows glowing east, then south, then west, as if it were alive. Pilgrims called it a miracle. Priests insisted it was impossible. In 2021, historians studying medieval architecture discovered the chapel's layout followed precise astronomical alignment. Narrow slits in its dome allowed sunlight to move across 3 inner altars during the solstice months. At dawn, noon, and dusk, light shifted exactly as legends described, making the chapel appear to turn. So it wasn't the stones that moved, it was the sky's own choreography, written centuries before telescopes. Those masons were not mystics, they were mathematicians who believed sunlight was prayer. Further north, across the Baltic Sea, another legend stirred in the fog, the bells beneath the water. Sailors claimed that when storms raged, they could hear church bells ringing from beneath the waves, calling ships home. People laughed, calling it fantasy. But in 2018, divers exploring the drowned village of Resel in Poland recorded metallic chimes echoing through submerged ruins. The sound came from ancient bronze fragments striking each other under current pressure, the broken remains of a 14th-century bell tower toppled during floods. The bells were real. They never stopped ringing, only changed their audience from the faithful to the fishes. Sometimes faith doesn't vanish when the sea rises. It just learns to breathe underwater. Our 26th legend comes from Brittany, where farmers whispered of the field that bloomed after midnight. They said that on one night each spring, wheat glowed blue and tiny lights drifted above the ground. For centuries, people called it superstition. But botanists later discovered a rare bioluminescent fungus that grew on old straw. It bloomed only once a year when humidity and moonlight matched perfectly. Those lights were real, shimmering through fields like stars fallen to earth. The villagers had not imagined heaven touching their crops, they had seen life's hidden glow. From fields of light, we moved to Ireland, and to one of its gentlest legends, the stone that heard confessions. In a small coastal village, there stood a black rock. People whispered their sins to it during storms, believing the sea would wash them clean. For centuries it was dismissed as folklore. But when geologists studied the stone, they found it naturally amplified sound. Its curved interior caught a whisper and sent it echoing softly like a heartbeat. The villagers hadn't been alone, their words truly returned to them, as if forgiven. Perhaps absolution doesn't always come from priests. Sometimes it's found in the patience of the earth itself. The 28th legend lives in Switzerland, the bridge that sang to children. Locals claimed that a wooden bridge over Lake Brienz hummed whenever children crossed, a tune like a lullaby. Skeptics said it was wind. Yet in 2007, engineers discovered harmonic frequencies produced by footsteps on its curved boards. The pitch changed with lighter weight, so only children triggered the melody. It wasn't magic. It was compassion built into architecture, a craftsman's gift to laughter. Even centuries ago, someone cared enough to let joy make noise. As we travel deeper into the night of history, Dost, notice how every miracle reveals not ignorance but tenderness, how the medieval world wrapped understanding in beauty. People didn't separate science from soul. They believed truth should also be kind. So when we listen to the next stories, listen with that same kindness. In Denmark, sailors told of the ship that never sank. According to legend, a single Viking longboat survived every storm because its hull remembered the sea. People said its wood was blessed. Centuries later, archaeologists discovered a preserved ship whose outer planks were lined with whale oil and pine resin, creating a natural waterproof seal far ahead of its time. The blessing was chemistry, the miracle craftsmanship. But who's to say the old captains were wrong? Maybe memory really does cling to wood that has loved the ocean too long. Across to Austria, another whisper, the candle that burned without fire. In monasteries, monks described a wax that glowed but never melted. They said it was the light of saints. Centuries later, fragments were tested and found to contain early phosphorescent minerals, ground into beeswax to create soft afterglow even after flame died. Their devotion had literally captured light. The miracle wasn't divine, it was curiosity blessed by patience. Our 31st legend takes us back to England, to a small town called Ely, where people spoke of the choir that couldn't stop singing. During one harsh winter, the abbey choir sang daily for warmth, and villagers swore they heard harmonies even after the singers left. Centuries later, restoration revealed that the curved ceiling perfectly preserved sound waves for several seconds longer than any ordinary space, long enough that echoes overlapped, creating the illusion of ghostly voices continuing the hymn. The abbey had been built to hold music longer than life. The echo became eternal prayer. Pause now, Dost. Look how truth glimmers behind every superstition. The medieval mind didn't live in darkness, it lived in wonder. It looked at wind and thought angel, saw reflection and thought soul, heard thunder and thought voice. Maybe belief was just the language of curiosity. Our 32nd legend belongs to Transylvania, where villagers spoke of the river that turned to glass. After each frost, they said, the river froze so clear you could read letters on the stones below. They thought it sacred. Scientists later confirmed that unique mineral purity and slow freezing produced flawless transparent ice, rare, almost invisible. Their holy water was real. The river truly became glass, a mirror where heaven looked at itself. And finally, a quieter one, not of places, but of people. In a small English hamlet, an old woman was said to dream of fires before they happened. Her neighbors feared her, called her witch. Only centuries later did diaries reveal she lived beside the town's first lightning conductor. The hum of charge sometimes woke her moments before storms struck. She wasn't cursed. She was listening to electricity before the world had a word for it. By now, the monk's quill has stopped scratching. Candle smoke curls upward like prayer. If he could see us now, with our laboratories and satellites, perhaps he would smile, knowing the legends he loved have finally been translated into equations. But maybe, Dost, he would also whisper a warning. Do not trade wonder for certainty. Because every time humanity thinks it knows everything, the earth hums a new secret through stone or sky, reminding us that the heart still understands what reason forgets. So when we lie awake tonight, listening to wind against our windows, maybe it's not just the wind. Maybe it's the world telling one more story, gentle, ancient, patient. And like all good legends, it ends not with proof, but with peace. The rain had long stopped. Outside, the valley shimmered like polished silver beneath dawn's mist. Inside the abbey ruins, only one candle remained, trembling on the altar, flame bending toward its own reflection. If you had stood there, Dost, you might have heard something soft. Not voices. Not wind. But memory itself, the breath of centuries exhaling peace. The monk's quill had dried. The parchment lay heavy with stories, of bridges that sang, stones that forgave, and bells that refused to die. But before we close his book, there were still a few legends left, the ones that never made it to the chronicles. The ones that belonged not to history, but to the human soul. Our 33rd legend comes from northern Italy, in a town called Viterbo. It was said there stood a well that granted courage. Not luck, not love, courage. People whispered that a sip of its water could still a soldier's trembling hand or a mother's grief. Centuries later, archaeologists found the well was lined with limestone rich in lithium, a mineral known even today to calm nerves. Those who drank from it truly did feel steadier. So perhaps courage isn't only born in hearts, sometimes, it seeps from the ground itself, one quiet drop at a time. The 34th legend drifted through Spain, along the dusty roads of Castile. They told of the painter who never finished his angels. He worked day and night, but each morning, villagers found the halos moved, tilted, smaller, or gone entirely. He thought he was cursed. In 2009, art restorers discovered that the original paint contained natural light-reactive silver powder. Over centuries, it had darkened and shifted under sunbeams, altering the faces in unpredictable ways. The angels had not left him, they were simply alive in the way only light can be. And maybe that's what all artists hope for, that their work keeps breathing even after their hands stop. Far away, in Scotland, came the tale of the island that appeared only in dreams. Fishermen claimed that beyond the horizon there was an island that revealed itself only to those who were lost. The mapmakers mocked them. Then, in the 20th century, oceanographers discovered a sandbar that periodically rose above water level during extreme low tide, visible for hours, then gone again. The lost had seen what the found could not. The 36th legend returns to France, near Dijon, the clock that counted prayers. A convent clock chimed not by hours but by whispered verses. It sounded random until modern historians reconstructed its gear system, revealing that the bells were tuned to align with psalm patterns, not time. Every toll was a prayer, measured not in minutes, but in mercy. And maybe that's the truest clock of all. There's a gentler one, Dost, from Bohemia, where people said that children born under eclipses could hear snow fall. They'd stand outside, heads tilted, smiling into white silence. Centuries later, doctors studying sound sensitivity found a rare auditory condition triggered by pressure shifts during lunar eclipses. Those children really could hear the whisper of flakes. The old world didn't call it science. They called it blessing. As these truths unfold, the candle's wick shortens. The monk's cell fades into dusk again. He pauses, maybe sensing your presence through the centuries. Because that's what stories do, they build bridges through time, so no listener ever sits alone. He looks up from his parchment, and for a moment, you can almost see his eyes, tired, kind, carrying both wonder and sorrow. He smiles. And begins one final legend. In an unnamed village somewhere between Germany and Faith, people told of the book that wrote itself. When left open overnight, new words appeared, sometimes poems, sometimes warnings. When it was finally studied centuries later, scholars discovered faint traces of invisible ink, written with lemon and salt, revealed only by candle heat. Each new monk, lighting his lamp to read, unknowingly revealed words left by the last. It wasn't magic, it was communion. They were all speaking to each other through firelight. And maybe, Dost, that's what we're doing right now, you and I, across this quiet century, through pixels and airwaves, retelling the same bedtime of humanity. The candle flickers lower. The parchment curls at its edges. The monk writes his last line. If legends are dreams, then truth is their awakening. He sets down the quill. The ink still shines wet, reflecting the dawn. Outside, morning birds begin their soft arguments with silence. The abbey bells, broken centuries ago, still echo faintly through mist, like a lullaby stitched into air. Every legend has found its truth. Every truth has found its listener. And in this hush, the Middle Ages finally sleep. But before the flame dies, one final truth remains, not written in any book, but carved into every heart that still wonders. The world is not divided between magic and reason. It's woven of both, the miracle of meaning in every ordinary thing. A grain of salt that preserves. A drop of water that steadies. A child hearing snow. A bridge that sings. A bell still ringing underwater. History, Dost, is not the story of what ended. It's the story of what refused to. The monk blows out the candle. Smoke curls upward, soft and silver, carrying centuries in its spiral. And as the screen fades to black, the way all nights eventually do, you hear one last whisper. Thank you for listening. Because that's all history ever wanted. Not to be believed. Just to be heard.